When Marcus Render lay dying, he asked his wife Bea for one last promise, that she would stay and look after his younger brother Zeke, who could not quite manage alone in the world, and would let no one but family close to him. Bea gave her word to her dying husband without a moment's hesitation. A solemn duty, a final gift to the man she was losing. She never once expected that in keeping a promise to a dying man, she would lose her whole heart to the brother he left in her care. To understand the promise, you have to understand the three of them, and the way their lives had braided together out in the Cane Hill country. Marcus and Bea Render had a good marriage, not a wild romance, but the deep, steady, true kind that wears well over years. Marcus was a solid, decent, hard-working man, and Bea had loved him honestly for the 11 years of their marriage, and he had loved her, and they had built a fine life together on the Render Ranch in the Cane Hill Valley. There had been no children, which was the one sorrow of it, but there had been contentment and partnership and a quiet, abiding affection that asked for nothing more than it had. Bea had expected to grow old beside Marcus Render. The fever that took him, swift and cruel one hard winter, was the last thing she ever saw coming. And then there was Zeke. Zeke Render was Marcus's younger brother by 4 years, and he had lived with Marcus and Bea on the ranch the whole of their marriage, not as a burden, exactly, but as a man the world had dealt a hard hand and who'd never quite recovered his footing. Years before, as a young man, Zeke had been caught under a falling load when a wagon gave way, and it had shattered his leg so badly that it never healed right. He walked with a heavy limp and a cane, in steady pain, unable to do the full hard work of a whole man. Marcus had taken him in without a second thought. The two brothers ran the ranch together, Marcus doing the heavy work and Zeke the rest, and it had worked, the three of them, for 11 years. But the accident had cost Zeke more than his leg. It had cost him his belief in himself. Somewhere in the long pain of it, Zeke Render had decided that he was half a man, that no woman would ever want a lame, broken fellow who couldn't even do a day's full work, that the ordinary life of a wife and a family and a place of his own was simply not for the court likes of him. And so he had armored himself in a kind of gentle resignation, kept the world at arm's length, let no one but Marcus and Bea truly close, and settled, in his own quiet mind, into the certainty that he would live and die alone, a lamed bachelor on his brother's charity, and that this was simply the shape his life would take. He was a good man, kind, quick-witted, deeper than he let on, but he had given up on himself so completely that he'd stopped letting anyone see it. And that was Marcus Render's great worry, dying. Not the ranch, not the money, not even Bea, who was strong and capable and would find her way. It was Zeke. Who would look after Zeke? Proud, lamed, self-doubting Zeke, who'd let no one but family near him, once Marcus was gone. So in his last days, Marcus called Bea to his bedside, and he asked her for the promise. "I'm not worried about you," he told her, his voice gone thin. "You're the strongest soul, Snow. You'll grieve me, and then you'll go on, and you'll be all right. It's Zeke." His eyes found hers, urgent. "He'll be lost without me, Bea. Not just the work, though there's that. It's that he's let himself believe he's nothing. Half a man, no good to anybody, fit only to live out his days alone. He's wrong about that. God, he's so wrong, but he's believed it so long he can't see past it. And with me gone, he'll just close up the rest of the way and let himself wither. I can't bear it. He's the best man I know, my brother, and he thinks he's worthless." Marcus gripped her hand with the last of his strength. "Promise me you'll stay. Promise me you'll look after him. Don't let him be alone, Bea. Don't let him give up. You'll see what I see in him, if you stay long enough to look. Promise me." And Bea Render, weeping, promised her dying husband that she would stay and look after his brother. She'd have promised him anything in that moment, but she meant it as the solemn duty it was, a widow's sacred charge, to keep faith with the man she'd loved by caring for the brother he'd loved. Nothing more. The thought that it might become anything more never crossed her grieving mind. Marcus died that night, and Bea Render set about keeping her promise. It was not easy at first, and not only because of the grief. Zeke Render did not want to be looked after. He was a proud man, and grieving his brother as deeply as Bea grieved her husband. And he was acutely, miserably uncomfortable with the whole arrangement. His brother's widow staying on the ranch for his sake, as though he were a child or an invalid who couldn't manage. "You don't have to stay, Bea," he told her, stiff and unhappy, not long after the funeral. "I know," Marcus asked it, "but you've your own life to think of. You could go to your people, sell your share, start fresh somewhere that isn't full of his ghost. I'll manage. I always have. You needn't tie yourself to a lame man and a hard ranch out of a promise to a dead man." "I gave my word," Bea said simply, "and I don't break my word. And it wasn't only for Marcus, Zeke, it was for you and for me. I've nowhere I'd rather be than the home he and I built, and no one I'd rather keep faith with than his brother. So I'm staying. You'll have to get used to it." So she stayed, and slowly the awkwardness wore down into something else. Because here is what happened over the months that followed, as the two of them held the Render Ranch together through the long work of grief. Bea Render came to truly know Zeke, the brother she'd lived alongside for 11 years and never quite seen. With Marcus gone, the two of them thrown together in the running of the place, and the bearing of their shared loss, the armor Zeke had worn his whole adult life began, almost against his will, to come down, and Bea began to see what Marcus had always seen and tried to tell her she would. She saw Zeke's deep, quiet goodness. She saw his sharp mind, the dry humor he'd kept hidden, the way he noticed things, the gentleness in him, the strength that had nothing to do with a sound leg. She saw a man worth 10 of most whole men, a man who'd decided he was worthless and was so completely, achingly wrong about it that it broke her heart to see. And the looking after became, somewhere in those months, entirely mutual. For Zeke looked after her too, steadied her in her grief as she steadied him in his, did 100 small kindnesses, was simply quietly there, the way she was there for him. He learned the days her sorrow ran deepest and found gentle reasons to be near. He noticed when she'd worn herself thin and quietly took up the slack, lame leg and all. They fell into the easy rhythm of two people who fit, sitting long in the lamplight of an evening with a comfortable silence. They were two people who had loved the same man, holding his place together, and in the holding of it they became, day by day, the center of each other's lives. It crept up on them both the way the truest things do, unasked and unnoticed, until it was simply, undeniably there. Bea Render fell in love with her dead husband's brother, and Zeke Render, who had spent his whole adult life certain that no woman could ever want him, fell just as hopelessly, and far more disbelievingly, in love with her. And then, having fallen, they were both nearly torn apart by the guilt of it. It was Zeke who suffered worst. When he could no longer deny to himself what he felt for Bea, it filled him not with joy but with a kind of horror. "My brother asked you to look after me," he said to her, anguished, the night it finally came into the open between them. "He trusted you. He put you here to take care of me out of love for both of us. And I've gone and I've fallen in love with his wife, his widow, the woman he trusted to me as a brother, not as God. Bea, what kind of man does that? Marcus isn't a year in the ground. I'm stealing his wife. I'm the lowest sort of man there is. Taking advantage of a promise he made you on his deathbed, turning his last gift into, he couldn't finish. It's wrong. Whatever this is between us, it's wrong. And it dishonors him, and I won't do it. I can't. You should go after all. I release you from the promise. Go, before I shame his memory any worse than I already have in my own heart." And Bea felt the same guilt, the same horror. She had loved Marcus truly, grieved him truly, and the thought that she'd fallen for his brother before he was cold in the ground felt like a betrayal of the good man she did bury. The two of them, who might have found in each other the answer to both their loneliness, instead tore themselves apart over the wrongness of it, and for a hard while it seemed the love that had grown between them would be strangled by guilt before it ever had the chance to live, and that Bea would leave after all, breaking the promise and abandoning the very man she'd sworn to look after, because staying had become unbearable. It was the memory of Marcus's own words that saved them. Bea lay awake one night, turning it over in her grief and her guilt, and she found herself going back as the grieving do over Marcus's last words to her. The promise, the bedside, the urgent grip of his hand. And she heard them again, truly heard them, for the first time since he'd spoken them. He thinks he's nothing. Half a man, no good to anybody, fit only to live out his days alone. He's wrong. God, he's so wrong, the best man I know, and he thinks he's worthless. Don't let him be alone, Bea. You'll see what I see in him, if you stay long enough to look. And Bea Render sat up in the dark, and understood, all at once, what Marcus had really been asking her. He hadn't only been asking her to keep his brother fed and the ranch running. He'd been asking her to do the one thing he could no longer do himself. To save Zeke from the lonely, withered, self-condemned life he was sentencing himself to. You'll see what I see in him, if you stay long enough to look. Marcus had known her. Marcus had known Zeke. Marcus, dying, with a clear-eyed love for the two people he was leaving behind, had known exactly what might happen if his strong, good-hearted widow stayed long enough to truly see his brother. He had not asked her to look after Zeke as one looks after an invalid. He had given them to each other. He had, with his last breath, tried to make sure that neither the wife he loved nor the brother he loved would have to be alone after he was gone. And he had done it the only way he could, by binding them together with a promise and trusting the rest to time and to their own two hearts. The blessing had been there in the promise all along. She had simply been too deep in grief and guilt to hear it. She told Zeke, the next morning, told him what Marcus had said, the exact words, and what she'd come to understand they meant. He wasn't asking me to keep you like a charity case, Zeke, she said. Listen to what he actually said. You'll see what I see in him, if you stay long enough to look. He knew. He knew what would happen if I stayed and really saw you. He was dying, and his last worry on this earth was that you'd spend your life alone, believing you were worthless. And his last act was to give you someone who'd stay long enough to prove you wrong. He gave us to each other, Zeke, on purpose. Because he loved us both too much to leave either of us alone, and because he knew, better than we did, that we'd be the saving of each other if we'd only let ourselves. Her voice broke. We're not betraying him. We're doing the last thing he asked. The thing he wanted most. We've been tormenting ourselves over dishonoring a man who spent his dying breath trying to bring this about. And Zeke Render, who had been so certain that loving Bea was a betrayal of his brother, finally understood that it was the opposite, that the brother who'd looked after him his whole life had, with his last strength, looked after him one final time, by leaving him the one woman who could see his worth. The guilt did not vanish all at once. Grief and love are tangled things, and they honored Marcus carefully, and gave it the proper time, and never once spoke of him as anything but the good man, who had been husband to one of them, and brother to the other, and the reason they'd ever found each other at all. But the wrongness was gone, replaced by something that felt instead like the fulfillment of a dying man's deepest wish. They married a respectable while later, quietly, in the Cane Hill country, the widow and her late husband's brother. And if a few tongues wagged at it, as tongues will, the people who'd known Marcus Render best understood and blessed it, because they knew the kind of man Marcus had been, and could believe, hearing the story, that giving Bea and Zeke to each other was exactly the sort of last gift he'd have wanted to leave. And Zeke Render, who had been so sure no woman could ever want a lame and broken man, spent the rest of his life being loved wholly by the finest woman he'd ever known, and became, under that love, the man Marcus had always seen in him, the worth he'd never been able to believe in proven to him 1,000 times over by a wife who'd stayed long enough to look. They kept Marcus's memory alive and honored all their days, named him often, spoke of him with love, never pretended he hadn't been the center of both their hearts before he was the bridge between them. Bea would say, in her old age, that she'd had 2 good loves in her life, and been luckier than any woman deserved, and that the second had been the gift of the first. Folks in the Cane Hill country told the story for years, and it always moved them, because there was something in it that the hardest heart could feel. She promised a dying man she'd look after his brother, they'd say. A solemn thing. A widow's duty. Keeping faith with the husband she'd lost by caring for the lame brother he left behind. She meant nothing more by it. And in the keeping of that promise, she went and lost her whole heart to the man, and he to her, who'd given up on ever being loved at all. They'd smile, the way you smile at a thing both sad and beautiful. And the wonder of it was that the dying man had known. He'd seen it coming from his deathbed, knew his strong, good wife and his lonely, good brother would be the saving of each other, if only he could bring them together. And so he bound them with a promise and trusted the rest to their own hearts. His last act on this earth was giving the two people he loved most to one another, so neither would have to be alone without him. And then they'd say the truest thing about it. That's what love does at its very best. It doesn't cling, it provides. Marcus Render couldn't take his wife and his brother with him where he was going, so he left them to each other instead. And she went looking to keep a promise, and found, waiting at the end of it, the last and greatest gift the man she'd buried ever gave her. A love she never went looking for, in the brother she'd sworn only to look after.